you ever wondered why we sometimes make decisions that don't seem logical even to ourselves? The answer often lies in cognitive biases, systematic patterns of deviation from rational judgment. These mental shortcuts help us process information quickly, but they can also lead us astray. In this video, we'll explore the fascinating world of cognitive biases, uncovering how they shape our choices, influence our perceptions, and sometimes trick us into making less than optimal decisions. Let's begin our journey into the hidden forces that guide our thinking. Cognitive biases are mental shortcuts, or heuristics that our brains use to simplify complex decision-making. While these shortcuts can be helpful, they often lead to errors in judgment. Imagine your brain as a busy office, constantly sorting through information. To save time, it relies on quick rules of thumb, but these can sometimes cause us to overlook important details or jump to conclusions. Understanding cognitive biases is the first step toward making better, more informed decisions. Heuristics are mental rules that help us make decisions quickly. For example, when choosing what to eat for lunch, you might pick something familiar without much thought. While this saves time, it can also lead to predictable mistakes. Heuristics are efficient, but they're not always accurate. Recognizing when you're relying on a heuristic can help you pause and consider whether it's leading you in the right direction. Anchoring bias occurs when we rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive. For instance, if you see a shirt priced at $100 and then see it on sale for $60, you might think it's a great deal even if $60 is still expensive. The initial price acts as an anchor, shaping your perception of value. This bias can influence everything from shopping to salary negotiation. Confirmation bias is our tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. Imagine reading news articles. You're more likely to notice and trust stories that align with your opinions. This bias can reinforce stereotypes and make it harder to change our minds, even when presented with new evidence. The availability heuristic leads us to overestimate the importance of information that comes to mind easily. For example, after hearing about airplane accidents on the news, people might think flying is more dangerous than it actually is. Our brains give more weight to vivid or recent memories, even if they're not representative of reality. Representativeness heuristic involves judging the probability of something based on how much it resembles a typical case. For instance, if someone is quiet and loves books, we might assume they're a librarian rather than a salesperson, even if there are more salespeople in the world. This bias can lead us to ignore actual statistics in favor of stereotypes. Overconfidence bias is when we overestimate our own abilities or knowledge. For example, many people believe they're better than average drivers, even though that's statistically impossible for everyone. This bias can lead to risky decisions and prevent us from seeking advice or double-checking our work. Hindsight bias is the tendency to see events as more predictable after they've happened. You might hear someone say, "I knew it all along," after a sports game or election result. This bias can make us overconfident in our ability to predict the future and less likely to learn from our mistakes. Self-serving bias is our tendency to attribute successes to our own abilities and failures to external factors. For example, if you ace a test, you might credit your intelligence, but if you fail, you might blame the teacher. This bias helps protect our self-esteem but can prevent honest self-reflection. Fundamental attribution error is when we attribute other people's actions to their character while attributing our own actions to circumstances. For instance, if someone cuts you off in traffic, you might think they're rude, but if you do it, you blame being late. This bias can affect how we judge others and ourselves. Sunk cost fallacy is when we continue investing in something because we've already put resources into it, even if it's no longer the best choice. For example, finishing a bad movie just because you've already watched an hour. Recognizing this bias can help us make better decisions by focusing on future benefits, not past investments. Loss aversion is our tendency to prefer avoiding losses over acquiring equivalent gains. Losing $10 feels worse than gaining $10 feels good. This bias can make us overly cautious and resistant to change, even when taking a risk could lead to better outcomes. Status quo bias is the preference to keep things the way they are, even when better options exist. We often stick with familiar routines or products simply because change feels uncomfortable. This bias can prevent us from exploring new opportunities or making improvements in our lives. The framing effect describes how the way information is presented can influence our decisions. For example, people react differently to 90% fat-free versus 10% fat labels, even though they mean the same thing. Marketers and politicians often use framing to sway opinions and choices. The recency effect is our tendency to remember the most recent information best. In a long list, we're more likely to recall the last few items. This bias can affect everything from studying for exams to making hearing decisions, as recent experiences weigh more heavily in our minds. The primacy effect is the opposite of the recency effect. It's our tendency to remember the first items in a sequence best. This is why first impressions are so powerful. Whether meeting someone new or hearing a list of facts, what comes first often sticks with us the longest. Optimism bias is our tendency to believe that we are less likely to experience negative events and more likely to experience positive ones. This can make us underestimate risks, like thinking we're less likely to get sick or have an accident. While optimism can be motivating, it can also lead to poor planning. Negativity bias is our tendency to give more weight to negative experiences than positive ones. For example, one critical comment can overshadow dozens of compliments. This bias can affect our mood, relationships, and even our willingness to take risks. The bandwagon effect is our tendency to do or believe things because many other people do. This is why trends catch on so quickly, from fashion to social media challenges. The desire to fit in can override our own judgment, leading us to follow the crowd. Authority bias is our tendency to attribute greater accuracy to the opinion of an authority figure. For example, we might accept a doctor's advice without question, even if it contradicts other evidence. This bias can be helpful but also dangerous if the authority is wrong. The halo effect is when our overall impression of a person influences how we feel and think about their character. For example, if someone is attractive or successful, we might assume they're also kind or intelligent. This bias can affect hearing decisions, friendships, and even legal judgments. In-group bias is our tendency to favor people who belong to the same group as us, whether it's based on nationality, sports teams, or even workplace departments. This bias can lead to unfair treatment of outsiders and reinforce divisions between groups. Outgroup homogeneity bias is the tendency to see members of other groups as more similar to each other than they really are. For example, thinking all fans of a rival sports team are the same. This bias can fuel stereotypes and misunderstandings. The just world hypothesis is the belief that people get what they deserve. This bias can lead us to blame victims for their misfortune, assuming that bad things only happen to bad people. It can prevent empathy and understanding of complex situations. The planning fallacy is our tendency to underestimate how long tasks will take. Whether it's a work project or home renovation, we often assume things will go smoothly and finish faster than they actually do. This bias can lead to missed deadlines and frustration. The Dunning-Kruger effect is when people with low ability at a task overestimate their ability. For example, someone new to chess might think they're a natural after a few wins. This bias can prevent learning and growth as people may not recognize their own limitations. Illusory correlation is the tendency to perceive a relationship between two unrelated things. For example, believing that carrying a lucky charm improves your chances of success. This bias can lead to superstitions and false beliefs. The gambler's fallacy is the belief that past random events affect future ones. For example, thinking a coin is due to land heads after several tails in a row. In reality, each flip is independent. This bias can lead to poor decisions in gambling and beyond. Survivorship bias is focusing on successful people or things and ignoring those that failed. For example, studying only successful businesses can give a distorted view of what it takes to succeed. This bias can lead to overestimating the likelihood of success. Choice-supportive bias is our tendency to remember our choices as better than they were. After making a decision, we often focus on its positives and downplay its negatives. This bias helps us feel good about our decisions but can prevent us from learning from mistakes. Actor-observer bias is when we attribute our own actions to external factors but others' actions to their character. For example, if you're late, you blame traffic. If someone else is late, you think they're irresponsible. This bias can affect how we interpret behavior. The false consensus effect is our tendency to overestimate how much others agree with us. We assume our opinions are more common than they really are, which can lead to misunderstandings and conflict, especially in group settings. The mere exposure effect is our tendency to prefer things simply because we're familiar with them. This is why repeated advertisements can make a product seem more appealing. Familiarity breeds comfort, even if we don't realize it. The peak-end rule is our tendency to judge an experience based on how we felt at its most intense point and at its end, rather than the average of every moment. For example, a vacation with a great ending will be remembered more fondly, even if parts were stressful. Projection bias is our tendency to assume that others share our current thoughts and feelings. For example, if you're hungry, you might think everyone else is too. This bias can lead to misunderstandings in communication and relationships. Pessimism bias is the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of negative outcomes. This can make us overly cautious or anxious and may prevent us from taking opportunities. While a little caution is healthy, too much pessimism can hold us back. The illusion of control is our tendency to overestimate our ability to control events. For example, thinking you can influence the outcome of a dice roll by how you throw it. This bias can lead to risky behavior and disappointment when things don't go as planned. Belief bias is our tendency to judge the strength of arguments based on whether we agree with the conclusion, rather than the logic. This can make us accept weak arguments that support our views and reject strong ones that don't. Choice overload is when having too many options makes it harder to make a decision. For example, standing in front of a wall of cereal boxes at the store can feel overwhelming. This bias can lead to decision fatigue and even avoiding making a choice altogether. The endowment effect is our tendency to value things more highly simply because we own them. For example, you might think your old car is worth more than someone else would pay for it. This bias can make it hard to part with possessions or negotiate fairly. The ostrich effect is our tendency to ignore negative information by burying our heads in the sand. For example, avoiding checking your bank account when you suspect bad news. This bias can prevent us from addressing problems and making informed decisions. Pro-innovation bias is the tendency to overvalue new ideas or technologies, assuming they are inherently better than existing ones. This can lead to adopting new solutions without fully considering their drawbacks or suitability. Salience bias is our tendency to focus on the most noticeable or emotionally striking information. For example, dramatic news stories grab our attention even if they're rare. This bias can distort our perception of reality and influence our decisions. Cognitive biases are a natural part of how our minds work, but being aware of them is the first step to making better decisions. By recognizing these mental shortcuts, we can pause, reflect, and choose more rationally. Whether in daily life or major choices, understanding cognitive biases empowers us to think more clearly and avoid common pitfalls. Keep these biases in mind as you navigate your next decision, and you'll be one step closer to outsmarting your own brain.